My son humiliated me in front of everyone, calling me crazy and useless, but I exposed his financial crimes: how he forged my signature, stole money through fake loans, and manipulated our family's property for his gain. His empire crumbled, justice was served, and everyone was stunned by the truth. You're crazy, Mother. Absolutely insane. Useless too. Honestly, why don't you just disappear? Those words fell from Caleb's mouth like shards of glass, each syllable slicing through the silence in the living room. The air froze, as if even the walls recoiled. The relatives, my nieces, nephews, cousins, and even my own grandchildren, shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others pretending they hadn't heard. But they had. Everyone had. I stood there, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the force it took not to collapse under the weight of my son's hatred. My daughter-in-law, Cheryl, smirked behind her wine glass, eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. She'd whispered those ideas into Caleb's ear for years, slowly poisoning him against me, until the boy I had once rocked to sleep now stood before me as my cruelest tormentor. I had raised Caleb alone after his father's sudden death. Worked 2 jobs. Sold my wedding ring to pay for his college tuition. I skipped meals so he wouldn't have to. And now? Now he dared to call me crazy in front of our entire family, humiliate me as though I were nothing but a rotting leaf underfoot. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply walked out of that room, slowly, with dignity, though my heart screamed like a siren beneath my skin. What they didn't know was that the woman they mocked wasn't broken. She was silent because she had a plan. 3 nights later, I sat across from Attorney Meredith Blake in her dimly lit office, documents spread between us. Bank statements. Property deeds. Company filings. You see, Caleb had gotten greedy. He thought no one would notice the forged signatures on the reverse mortgages, the money funneled through offshore accounts, the name Eleanor Briggs, mine, used to secure fraudulent loans he never intended to repay. But I noticed. Because before I was a grieving widow or a discarded mother-in-law, I was a bookkeeper. And I never forgot numbers. I hadn't just come for revenge. I came to reclaim my name. My life. My dignity. I would not strike back in anger, but in silence, with precision. The next family gathering would not end in my shame. It would begin with his downfall. Before we continue, I need to ask you, have you ever been humiliated by your own child? Silenced in front of family while others just watched? If my story speaks to your pain, please like, share, and subscribe. I promise this isn't just about revenge. It's about what we become when no one stands up for us. And let me know where you're listening from. I want to hear from women like me, who were once invisible. I didn't sleep the night after that meeting. My eyes stayed open as the ceiling above me shifted between moonlight and shadow, while my mind replayed Caleb's voice like a skipping record: crazy, useless, disappear. Words meant to unmake me. Break me. But they didn't know, I come from a line of women who survived war, famine, and men who tried to silence them with fists or shame. What Caleb didn't inherit from me was my patience. And my memory. 2 things he'd fatally underestimated. At 4:17 a.m., I slipped out of bed and put on the sweater I used to wear when Caleb was still a boy and afraid of thunderstorms. I passed by his old room, now empty since he'd taken the master bedroom for himself and banished me to the guest room like a burden. Cheryl had even suggested I turn the garage into my own space. Imagine that. A widow who paid off the house, reduced to sleeping beside oil cans and lawn tools. I climbed the attic stairs slowly. Each one creaked as if remembering the weight of years gone by. The dust clung to my fingers and sleeves as I rummaged through half-forgotten holiday ornaments, childhood report cards, and broken keepsakes. Then I saw it, a cracked blue storage bin tucked behind an old sewing machine. Inside was a manila envelope with faded writing: Briggs Holdings, Archive. My fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from the gravity of what I knew it held. I opened it slowly, reverently. Inside were crisp copies of every property deed, every early business loan I'd co-signed for Caleb, every signature he thought had been long buried. There were scanned PDFs of our land division, financial summaries, and even a handwritten letter from my late husband outlining the trust we had formed before he passed, a trust Caleb never knew existed, because I never told him. Because even then, I had a feeling he might grow into something unrecognizable. I took everything down to the kitchen, brewed myself a strong pot of coffee, and waited until the sun rose before calling Meredith. I'd known Meredith Blake since we volunteered together at the local church pantry in the 90s. She'd since become one of the most respected estate lawyers in the county, sharp as glass and twice as dangerous. She didn't ask many questions when I told her what I had. She simply said, "Come in. Bring everything. And Eleanor? Don't speak a word of this to anyone." By 11 a.m., I was sitting across from her in her modest but immaculate office. I laid the envelope between us, and she handled the documents like they were sacred relics. "My God," she whispered after 20 minutes of silence. "He used your name to secure over $300,000 in loans. Forged your signature here, here, and here. He placed liens on your house without telling you, and funneled money through a fake nonprofit under your maiden name." She looked up at me, her expression darkening. "This isn't just elder abuse, Eleanor. This is federal fraud." I nodded. "And I want it all documented, quietly. No police." "Not yet." "Why?" she asked. "This is open and shut. We could have him in jail within a month." I looked her straight in the eye. "Because I want him to fall publicly, Meredith. Not from the hands of strangers. I want the same living room where he humiliated me to be the place he's exposed. I want my family to see who he really is." She leaned back and smiled slowly. "Then we'll build it piece by piece." That evening, I returned home with photocopies locked in my purse and the originals hidden in a bank safety deposit box under my control. And just as I locked my bedroom door, I heard it, Caleb's voice drifting through the window. I peeked through the blinds. He was in the backyard, pacing, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. I saw his body tense, his tone sharp. "I told you, she's delusional. No one believes her anymore. Let her dig around. She won't find anything." Then he chuckled. Laughed, actually. That's what broke me. That laughter. So casual, so heartless. As if I were nothing but a failing memory to be swept under a rug. I stared at him from the window, wondering what kind of man he had become. What I had missed while raising him. Or maybe I hadn't missed it. Maybe I just chose to believe that love alone could change a person. That belief had kept me in place for too long. The next morning, I did something bold. Something I hadn't done in 2 decades. I reached out to my niece, Ivy Jameson. Brilliant. Tough. A forensic accountant who had once tried to expose Caleb's mishandling of charity funds when they were both in their 20s. The family turned on her, believed Caleb's lies, and Ivy disappeared from our lives like smoke. But I never stopped thinking about her. "I have proof. I need your help," I typed. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Then I pressed send. She replied within 10 minutes. Finally, she wrote. That one word was all I needed. Not a greeting. Not an apology. Just a single breath of fire waiting to be aimed. The storm had begun to gather, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. I was the storm. The knock on my back door came at exactly 9 p.m. that Thursday evening, soft, deliberate, and strangely familiar. I didn't answer right away. I watched from the kitchen window as Ivy stood in the moonlight, hands tucked into her black wool coat, face thinner than I remembered but eyes still sharp. She didn't look like someone returning to a family that once banished her. She looked like someone coming to settle unfinished business. When I finally opened the door, neither of us spoke. We simply stared at one another, 2 women who had once stood on the same side of a lie but been torn apart by the rest of the family. Then, Ivy stepped in, set her bag on the counter, and said, "Where's the coffee?" I smiled. Still strong and bitter. Just like us. As we sat across the table, the years melted with each word. Ivy hadn't just survived after she was pushed out, she had risen. Now one of the top private forensic analysts on the East Coast, she specialized in uncovering fraud, laundering, and financial deception. Caleb didn't just destroy my credibility back then, she said, sipping from her chipped mug. He used me as a scapegoat so he could cover up his early financial blunders. And the family chose him. I looked down, ashamed. I hadn't defended her back then. I had believed Caleb, because I wanted to. Because it was easier than believing my son was capable of such deception. I owe you an apology, I said quietly. Ivy shook her head. You don't owe me anything. You just better be ready for what happens next. Once we start digging, there's no going back. I retrieved the manila folder from the lockbox under the sink. Ivy read every document, every signature, every timeline. Her eyes narrowed as she flipped through. He was sloppy, she muttered. He got arrogant. These dates don't even match. And this transfer here? He forged a notarized signature from someone who died a year prior. I leaned forward. Can you prove that? She nodded. Already did. I looked him up on the drive over. I've got tools now, Eleanor. You don't know what I've become. But I was beginning to. Ivy wasn't the same girl who had once wept outside our home after Caleb accused her of embezzlement. She was steel now, wielded with precision and vengeance. And in her, I found the ally I never thought I'd have. Over the next few days, Ivy turned the house into a war room. My old dining table became a sea of laptops, files, charts, and USB drives. Every night, she stayed up until 3 a.m., hacking into digital records, tracing funds, flagging inconsistencies in Caleb's real estate holdings. What we uncovered made my stomach twist. Caleb hadn't just stolen from me, he'd used my name to scam several elderly neighbors into signing over power of attorney, pretending he was setting up retirement trusts on their behalf. At least 2 of them had died in assisted living facilities with barely anything left. He's not just greedy, Ivy said one night. He's dangerous. But we still needed more. A final piece. Something irrefutable. And then, fate delivered it. That Sunday afternoon, Caleb forgot to log out of his laptop. He'd left it open in the living room while he stepped out for a phone call. Cheryl was in the shower, and I moved quickly, sitting at the computer like I had every right in the world. Because I did. It was my house. My life. Had stolen everything else, he wouldn't steal this moment. I navigated into his email. My hands were steady, to my surprise. I found a folder titled, Hold, Legal Risk. And inside it, screenshots of altered bank records, lists of offshore dummy corporations, and one email that made my blood run cold. It was from a man named Martin Vexler, a known fraudster Ivy had warned me about earlier. The subject line read, Mother is asking questions again. And the body said, if she doesn't back off, we'll need to expedite the medical solution. Old people fall all the time. One slip and the problem's gone. I stared at the screen, my vision pulsing. Caleb wasn't just trying to silence me legally. He was willing to end me. My own son. I copied everything to a flash drive and hid it under a floorboard in the guest room. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply sat with Ivy in the dark, my fingers wrapped tightly around a warm cup of tea. He's going to try something, I said quietly. Ivy nodded. Let him. Because now, we had what we needed. Proof not just of fraud, but of intent to harm. And we weren't going to the police just yet. No, Caleb would face a deeper justice. The kind where his whole world collapsed in front of everyone who ever believed in him. Just like he'd wanted to do to me. The next family meeting was in 1 week. A financial update, Caleb called it. And oh, there would be one. But it wouldn't be his. It wasn't the dress I planned to wear to my own funeral, but it might as well have been. It was deep navy, simple, clean, timeless. I hadn't worn it since Caleb's wedding, when I still believed my son loved me, and when Cheryl pretended she wanted a mother-in-law. I stood in front of the mirror and buttoned it slowly, one pearl at a time, thinking about the woman I was back then, hopeful, quiet, almost invisible. That woman was gone. She died the night her only child humiliated her in front of the family. The woman staring back at me now was sharper. Older. Hungrier for justice. The family meeting was 3 days away, and Caleb had no idea he was planning his own unraveling. He was busy preparing a sleek PowerPoint presentation on family investments, likely another ploy to justify bleeding money from our assets. Cheryl had begun acting smug again, like she had after Caleb tricked me into signing a fake, joint ownership document of the house last year, one Meredith had proven legally void. But they didn't know the fortress they thought they controlled now had termites in every wall. That night, Ivy came home with 2 thick folders. One for Meredith. One for the press, she said as she slammed them onto the kitchen table. The financial trails are complete. And I traced the Vexler account. They paid a private caregiver at Rosehill Estate under a fake name. One of the women your son manipulated into handing over power of attorney? She died 6 months later after a mysterious fall. No police report. No autopsy. I swallowed hard. Are you saying? Ivy looked at me, her voice flat. I'm saying your son is capable of more than theft. The room chilled. I walked over to the drawer where I kept Caleb's baby shoes, still soft, still tiny. I hadn't touched them in years. I set them gently on the table. I rocked him every night when he was teething, I whispered. He used to cry and reach for me in his sleep. Ivy didn't respond. She knew there was no answer to that kind of grief, only survival. The next morning, I found a strange envelope on my porch. No name. No return address. Inside was a photograph of me and Ivy, taken through the kitchen window. We were sitting at the table, reviewing documents. The image was blurry but threatening. On the back, scrawled in crooked block letters, were the words, "Old women should mind their business before someone minds it for them." I held it in my hands for a long time. I didn't panic. I didn't even tremble. Instead, I pulled out a shoebox from the hall closet and tucked the photo beneath a stack of evidence we were collecting, because every threat Caleb threw at me now only strengthened my resolve. I'm done being prey, I said to Ivy. It's time to set the trap. So we rehearsed. Not once, not twice, but 6 times. The order of the files. The order of the recordings. The email printed and sealed. The presentation Ivy would give if I faltered. We even installed a mini camera in my necklace. I wanted a full recording of Caleb's face when I exposed everything. If he tried to talk over me, lie, gaslight me, I wanted the truth to be undeniable. 2 nights before the meeting, something unexpected happened. I got a call from my granddaughter, Grace. She was just 16, always shy, always sweet, the only one in that house who still hugged me without an eye roll. "Grandma," she whispered, I overheard Dad and Mom talking. "They said you were going to a nursing home soon, and they were laughing. Are you okay?" I nearly dropped the phone. I blinked back tears and steadied my voice. "I'm okay, darling. And thank you for telling me. You're very brave." There was a pause. "They scare me," she said. "They're mean when no one's around. I don't know why." I wanted to scoop her into my arms, protect her from everything. But I knew I couldn't, not yet. Caleb's control had spread into the next generation. If I didn't act now, it wouldn't just be my life he'd destroy. It would be hers. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared out the window. The stars were unusually clear. Ivy came in quietly and stood next to me. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked. I nodded. I want him to feel what I felt. To be stripped of pride. To see the people he thinks love him look at him with disgust. Just once, I want him to know what it's like to be disposable. We didn't speak after that. The silence was full of preparation, of finality. The dress hung beside my door like armor. The folders were packed. The hidden camera was charged. The storm had built for long enough. In 3 days, Caleb Briggs would no longer be my shame. He would be his own. Caleb called it a family strategy session. Said he wanted to align everyone's expectations about future investments. I could almost hear the smugness in his voice through the invitation letter he emailed to the entire family, complete with a tacky gold emblem and the subject line, "Building the Briggs Legacy." I laughed when I read it. Legacy. What legacy does a man build when it's made of lies, theft, and betrayal? The meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon in the same living room where he'd humiliated me 3 weeks ago. The room where I'd once strung garlands for Christmas, where I used to serve hot cider to guests, where Caleb took his first steps. And now, it would become the courtroom. And he would be the defendant. That morning, I woke early and braided my hair like my mother used to do before something serious. Ivy laid out everything: the black briefcase with our files, my necklace camera with a full battery, and a sleek folder with the words, "In Trust We Break," printed across the cover. The title was her idea. "If you're going to shatter him," she'd said, "make sure you name the hammer." I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't need food. I was full of fire. At 1:05 p.m., the guests arrived. Aunts. Uncles. Cousins. Caleb's friends from his construction firm. His lawyer, Cheryl's cousin Matthew, who looked at me like I was an expired carton of milk. Cheryl played the perfect hostess, waltzing around with trays of iced tea and fake smiles. Grace sat quietly on the couch, avoiding her parents' eyes, her hands nervously twisting a hair tie around her fingers. No one suspected what was coming. Not even close. Caleb wore a charcoal gray suit with a gold tie, the same one he'd worn when he made partner at the firm I had helped finance. I watched as he stood at the front of the room, sipping from a crystal tumbler, commanding attention like a king on his throne. "Thank you all for coming," he began, "especially Mom." His eyes slid toward me, laced with mock sweetness. "I know it's hard for her to understand the numbers these days, but we all love her dearly and want her to feel included." A few family members chuckled politely. I didn't smile. I simply reached for my folder. He launched into his slideshow, colorful charts, buzzwords, fake projections, the whole charade. At one point, he clicked to a slide titled "Generational Vision," and I nearly laughed. The gall of it. After 30 minutes of his performance, he turned toward me again. "Now, before we wrap up, I think it's only fair that Mother say a few words." His tone was syrupy, like a man tossing a bone to an old dog. I stood slowly. My hands didn't shake. "Thank you, Caleb," I said, my voice calm. "Yes. I do have a few words. Just a few truths, actually." I opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. This is a notarized document from Briggs Holdings, dated 6 years ago, where Caleb used my signature to secure a $215,000 loan against my property. Only, I never signed it. Caleb's expression didn't change immediately. He was good at pretending. But his jaw twitched. A murmur spread through the room. Cheryl stopped pouring drinks. Her hand hovered mid-air as if she forgot what gravity was. A murmur spread through the room like a storm cloud shifting across clear skies. Caleb's confident stance faltered, just for a second, but enough for me to see it. A crack in his mask. He tried to laugh it off. "Mom, I think you've misunderstood what that document." I held up another page. "This one," I interrupted, "shows the transfer of ownership of my house, supposedly signed by me last spring. I was in the hospital that day. I have medical records to prove it." Another hush. Someone coughed. Someone else leaned forward in their chair. "And this," I lifted a third sheet, thick and stamped, "is an affidavit from Martin Vexler's former assistant. The one you paid to forge my signature and silence 2 elderly women you scammed through your retirement trust fund." One of those women died after being moved into a facility you claimed was top tier. Her son never knew what happened to her finances until we showed him your records. Caleb's mouth opened. Then closed. His skin lost a shade of color. Matthew, Cheryl's cousin and attorney, shot up from his seat. This isn't the time or place for legal accusations. It's exactly the place, Ivy cut in, standing beside me. Her presence was electric, her voice measured but fierce. We've submitted full evidence of fraudulent activity, forged documentation, and financial abuse to the state's Elder Protection Office. This meeting is being recorded. If anyone wants to defend Mr. Briggs, you'll want to be very careful with your words. The air thickened. No one moved. Then Grace stood. Her voice was small but sharp. Dad, is it true? Caleb looked at her. His eyes flickered. I could tell he wanted to lie. Wanted to reach for the slick charm he'd used his whole life. But for the first time, he was surrounded by people who weren't clapping. People who were seeing him. Really seeing him. He turned to me instead. You're my mother. You're right, I said softly. I am. That's why I kept forgiving. Even when I found the first forged document. Even when you sold part of the family land behind my back. I wanted to believe you were still the boy I raised. The boy who cried when his hamster died. But now I see it clearly. That boy's gone. Someone in the back, my cousin Janice, muttered, "Dear God," then Cheryl snapped. This is absurd. Eleanor's just trying to sabotage Caleb because she doesn't want to hand over control. She's always had issues with power, ever since. No, I said, facing her. You poisoned him. Slowly. But he drank every drop willingly. I have recordings, Ivy added, clicking a button on her tablet. Caleb's voice echoed through the room. If she doesn't stop snooping, we'll speed up the medical solution. Old people fall all the time. A few people gasped. One of Caleb's colleagues stood up and walked out. His uncle Robert stared at him in horror. You were going to hurt your own mother? I didn't mean that. Caleb barked. It was taken out of context. No, I said. It wasn't. Then I did something that felt more powerful than yelling, more final than slapping him. I stepped back. I looked at Caleb and I said, from this day forward, I don't recognize you. You are no longer my son. You're just a man who thought no one would fight back. The silence that followed was absolute. And then, for the first time in years, applause, small, hesitant at first, began to rise from the side of the room. Janice. Robert. Even a few of Caleb's coworkers. Grace walked across the room and stood beside me. I believe her, she said quietly. Caleb's face turned red, then pale, then blank. He looked like he was falling from the inside out. Cheryl reached for his hand. He pulled it away. I turned toward the door. Ivy followed, the briefcase in her hand. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. That living room, where I had once been humiliated, was now my courtroom, my victory stage, and my freedom. And Caleb? He wasn't a king anymore. He was a warning. The quiet after a public storm is a strange thing. You expect the world to celebrate your courage, maybe even hand you a medal for surviving cruelty with grace. But what really follows is silence. Thick, uncomfortable silence. People don't know what to say when a mother exposes her own son. Some look at you like a hero. Others, like a traitor. The day after the family meeting, I woke early. I brewed my coffee the same way I always did, 2 scoops, boiling water, no cream. But everything else felt different. The house was still, and not because no one was home, but because it had stopped pretending. It was no longer a prison in disguise. It was just a building again. Mine. Caleb hadn't come back that night. Cheryl had stormed out 15 minutes after I left, screaming at him in front of half the family. Ivy told me later that he'd locked himself in their bedroom and refused to speak. Meredith had already submitted the initial complaint to the state attorney's office. The press wasn't involved, yet. But the documents were in place, and the walls around Caleb's empire were beginning to rot from the inside. Around 11 a.m., Grace knocked gently on my bedroom door. I was sitting in the armchair beside the window, reading over a letter my husband had written to Caleb when he was 14. It was full of fatherly advice, hope, encouragement. I hadn't read it in years. Now the words stung. "Can I come in?" Grace asked softly. "Of course, sweetheart." She sat on the edge of my bed, legs curled under her, like she used to when she was little and I'd read her fairy tales. "Are you okay?" she asked. I set the letter down. "I think so. Are you?" She nodded, but slowly. "People at school are talking about it. Someone posted a clip from the meeting on Facebook. A cousin recorded it. Ivy had suspected someone might. It wasn't part of our plan, but it might serve us better than we imagined." "Are they being cruel to you?" I asked. "No," she whispered. "Just curious. Some said your speech was the bravest thing they've ever seen." I reached for her hand. She held mine tightly, her fingers small but strong. "I never wanted it to come to this, Grace," I said. "But when people show you who they are, you either look away, or you finally see them." I chose to see. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question I feared and expected in equal measure. "Did Dad really want to hurt you?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I studied her face, the same soft freckles across the nose that her father had, the same sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wasn't a child anymore. Not after what she'd witnessed. "He didn't want to see me stand up," I said carefully. "He wanted me small. And yes, when people are desperate to stay in control, they'll say and do dangerous things. Even to their own blood." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "He always said you were dramatic. That you twisted things." "I know," I said. "And I let him say it for years. That's my burden to carry. But what I did yesterday, I did for me. And for you." We sat together for a while, saying nothing. Then, just as she was about to leave the room, she turned back. "Grandma?" "Yes?" "I'm really proud of you." Those 5 words broke something inside me. Not painfully, but cleanly, like snapping the last link of a chain. I stood and pulled her into my arms. She cried into my shoulder while I smoothed her hair and whispered, "You're safe now. I won't let him take anything from you either." Later that evening, Ivy returned with updates. 3 banks flagged his transactions. 1 account was frozen. And guess what else? She handed me her laptop. His business partners have started to distance themselves. One posted a statement calling his behavior concerning. Another's already consulting lawyers. I stared at the screen, numb. "He's losing everything." She nodded. "Piece by piece." But then she looked at me strangely. "There's something else. I got a call from someone named Vera, your neighbor on Willow Lane." I nodded slowly. "We used to garden together." "What did she say?" "She asked if it was true, that you uncovered a fraud ring using fake elder accounts. She says her brother died in that facility last year, after signing over his finances to a Caleb Briggs trust. She thought it was her brother's dementia. But now, she's not so sure." My stomach tightened. There could be more victims. Dozens, Eleanor. Maybe more. I leaned back in my chair, hands clasped together. This wasn't just about me anymore. Caleb hadn't simply betrayed his mother, he had preyed on others, counting on their confusion, their isolation, their age. I had set out to expose him for my own healing. Now, I realized something larger was taking shape. I wasn't just his victim. I might be the only one left standing with the truth. By the next morning, I realized the war I'd stepped into wasn't just about reclaiming my dignity, it was about stopping a man who had built his life by destroying others. I had imagined the pain Caleb caused me was unique, personal, something born from a twisted mother-son dynamic. But now, it was bigger. I wasn't the only one he manipulated. I wasn't even the first. Vera came to the house around noon. She looked older than I remembered, her white hair pulled tightly into a bun, her shoulders tense with unspoken grief. She sat down at my kitchen table without asking, like women who've been neighbors long enough don't need permission. "I didn't know what to say to you before," she began, clutching a worn brown envelope. "I watched your family gathering video online. Someone sent it to my niece. She forwarded it to me last night." I didn't interrupt her. I could tell she wasn't ready to hear comfort, only the truth. "My brother Henry," she said. "He was the last family I had. He started showing signs of memory loss last spring. Your son came to visit him, said he was starting a family-oriented fund that protected assets for elders. Said you had already signed on." I felt my breath catch. "He used my name?" Vera nodded, her jaw tightening. "He said you recommended him. That he was trustworthy." I didn't know he'd drained Henry's account until after the funeral. Everything was gone. Caleb had the power of attorney. I thought, maybe Henry had been confused. But after seeing that video, I know he wasn't. She pushed the envelope toward me. Inside were copies of bank statements, legal letters, and one of Caleb's fake contracts, his signature written in smooth, practice strokes. "I should have said something," she said, voice cracking. "But I didn't want to believe he'd done this on purpose. Not to someone like Henry. Not to someone who trusted him." I reached for her hand. "You weren't wrong to hope he was better. So was I. But hoping doesn't change what he did." "I want to help," she whispered. "I want to speak up if this goes to court. He stole from Henry, but he stole from me too. From everyone who loved him." As Vera left, I stood at the doorway and watched her walk down the porch steps, her figure slow but determined. Another woman who had lived in silence for too long. Another victim. Another witness. I turned to Ivy. She had been standing in the hallway, listening. Her face was pale but fierce. "We need to go public," she said. "Not just quietly submit things to the DA. We go loud. Press. Advocates. Elder abuse watchdog groups. If we expose him publicly, the others might come forward. This isn't just a family scandal, Eleanor. This is a criminal network." I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the house pulse around me like a living heart. "Do you think I can handle that?" I asked. She looked at me. "You've already handled more than most women could survive." I didn't answer right away. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. If we went public, Caleb's life would be over. Not just his business, his marriage, or his inheritance. But his entire reputation. His name. And maybe, so would mine. What would people say? That I waited too long? That I didn't protect the others soon enough? That I was complicit in some way? The shame whispered inside me, crawling up from my ribs like old ghosts. But then I remembered the bruises I'd covered. The gaslighting. The long, painful silences while Caleb and Cheryl twisted my words, made me doubt my own memories. I remembered how I used to smile at family dinners while they joked about me losing it. And I remembered the moment I heard him say, "Old people fall all the time." No. I wouldn't protect him anymore. That night, Ivy drafted the email to the Herald Tribune, a local paper with national reach and a history of investigative journalism. She attached documents, photos, audio clips, and a copy of the fraud complaint already submitted to the state. She signed the bottom of the email with my name. "I'm not sending it unless you click the button yourself," she said. I sat at the table. Looked down at the blinking cursor. The room was silent except for the slow tick of the kitchen clock. Click. It was done. We went to bed late that night. I didn't sleep. I watched the shadows stretch across my ceiling and wondered if Caleb was sitting in his own darkness too, if he sensed that something irreversible had just happened. The next morning, at 6:43 a.m., the newspaper replied. Subject, urgent, requesting interview and full statement for front page story. I stared at the email. My chest tightened, but not from fear. From power. For the first time in decades, the world would hear my voice. Not his. The sound of my name printed in bold black ink was more jarring than I'd imagined. I unfolded the morning edition of the Herald Tribune with hands that didn't quite feel like my own. The headline stretched across the top like a battle cry: Elder Fraud Ring Uncovered, Victims Speak Out Against Local Businessman Caleb Briggs, and just beneath it, my face. A photo taken from the family meeting paused mid-sentence as I stood holding the damning document. The journalist had chosen the perfect shot, my posture straight, my gaze steady. Not a victim. Not a frail old woman. But a witness. A warrior. I ran my fingertips over the newsprint like it was sacred. Beneath the photo, the article began. After decades of financial manipulation and emotional coercion, a retired bookkeeper has come forward to expose her own son as the orchestrator of a widespread elder abuse fraud network. What began as a family dispute has unraveled into something far more sinister. They got it right. Every quote. Every number. Every accusation backed by evidence, carefully vetted by their legal department before the ink dried. Ivy came downstairs with 2 cups of tea. She paused when she saw the paper. You read it already? I've been awake since 4, I said, smiling softly. You only think you're the fighter in this family. She grinned and handed me the cup. Phone's about to start ringing. It did. Within the hour. The first call was from a woman named Dolores, 83, from across the county. She'd read the article and recognized Caleb's name. He visited my senior group last year, she said, her voice shaking. Told us he was a financial guardian. I gave him access to my savings. My son thought I was just being forgetful, but I knew something was wrong. Your story, it gave me clarity. Then came another call. Then 5 more. Then 11. By 2 p.m. Ivy had created a spreadsheet titled Potential Victims, Briggs Scheme, and we were already on row 43. The news wasn't just traveling fast, it was traveling with purpose. Grace came home from school unusually quiet. She hovered at the kitchen entrance, clutching her phone like it was the last piece of solid ground beneath her feet. Some of my friends saw the article, she said. And what did they say? They said, your photo made them cry. One girl said her grandma went through something similar but never talked about it. She paused. I didn't know people could be proud of someone for doing something like this. I set down my tea and walked over to her. Grace, sometimes telling the truth doesn't make you popular. It just makes you free. And sometimes it makes others free, too. She hugged me tight. But peace didn't last long. By evening, Cheryl showed up. Not with Caleb. Alone. She stormed into the front yard like a woman possessed, her phone clutched tightly in one hand and designer sunglasses pushed up like armor. I saw her through the window and stepped out before she could bang on the door. You've ruined us, she snapped. I said nothing. Do you have any idea what you've done to Caleb's reputation? His firm dropped him this morning. Our accounts are frozen. The press is stalking us. Our daughter is being harassed at school. I let her finish. She needed to scream. That was fine. But when she paused for air, I spoke. Calm. Clear. I protected you once, Cheryl. Do you remember that? She blinked, startled. I knew, years ago, what Caleb was doing. The manipulations. The coercion. The lies. I saw how you smiled when I was humiliated in front of guests. I saw the bruises you left on Grace's confidence every time you told her she wasn't smart enough, thin enough. And I stayed silent, thinking maybe if I loved you both harder, you'd love me back. But love doesn't work like that. And I don't owe you protection anymore. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she looked like a scared child. Then she whispered, "They're going to arrest him." I nodded. Good. She walked away without another word. I didn't watch her go. Inside, Ivy was on the phone with a representative from the Elder Protection Bureau. They were requesting a formal statement and interview. A task force was being assembled. What started as a family confrontation had now become a full-blown federal investigation. That night, I sat alone in the quiet again. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The wounds were still there, old and new, but something beneath them had strengthened. Hardened. I wasn't Eleanor, the invisible matriarch with a gentle voice and an ignored opinion. I was Eleanor Briggs, the woman who said no more. And finally, the world listened. 2 days after the story hit the press, the house phone rang with a familiar name on the caller ID, Joan Briggs. Caleb's aunt. My late husband's sister. A woman who'd once braided my hair the morning of my wedding, who sat beside me at the hospital the day Caleb was born, who gave me silent nods across Thanksgiving tables when Cheryl rolled her eyes at my prayers. I hadn't heard from her in years. Not since Caleb and Cheryl slowly turned every family gathering into a power parade. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" There was a pause. Then Joan's voice came, low and careful. "You blew the damn roof off, Eleanor." I didn't know whether to laugh or hang up. "I read the article," she continued. "Then I read it again. I thought, maybe it was exaggerated. Maybe you'd lost your mind like everyone said. But then I saw the documents. The recordings. Ivy's spreadsheet. I know what I'm looking at. You weren't crazy. You were right." Something stung behind my eyes. I swallowed it. "I was never looking for vindication, Joan. I was looking for safety. For truth." She sighed. "I want to help now. If you'll let me. There's more you don't know." I sat down slowly. "I'm listening." Joan began to speak. Quietly. Guiltily. She told me how, years ago, Caleb approached her with a confidential family trust expansion. He claimed it was part of an early inheritance plan. She gave him $25,000 from her retirement savings. He promised it would grow. He even gave her false quarterly reports, complete with graphs and forged accountant signatures. "I never told anyone," she said. I was ashamed. I thought it was just me. I closed my eyes. The weight of Caleb's betrayal was no longer confined to me. He had robbed people who once rocked him to sleep, kissed his forehead, celebrated his birthdays. He hadn't just become cruel, he had calculated it. "Can you speak to the task force?" I asked. There was a pause. Then, "Yes. I owe you that." After I hung up, Ivy came into the room with another update. "Vera called," she said. 2 more women from her church group came forward. One gave Caleb $40,000. The other signed over control of her pension. We're up to 73 confirmed victims. 73. I had expected 5. 10, maybe. 73. I pressed my hands to my chest. My heart wasn't racing, it was hurting. The scope of it. The intentionality. Caleb hadn't just slipped into this. He had mapped it. He had studied his victims. Targeted them. Like predators do. That night, I sat by the fireplace and stared at the embers. I thought about the Caleb I once knew, his chubby fingers learning to tie shoes, his panicked face the first time he scraped his knee, the way he used to whisper, "I love you, Mama," in his sleep. Where had he gone? Was he buried under all the greed? Or had I imagined him entirely? Grace sat beside me, curling into my arm. He won't get away with it, right? No, I said firmly. He won't. There was silence between us for a long while. Then she whispered, I'm scared he's going to come here. I didn't answer right away. Truth was, I was scared too. The next day, our fear arrived in the form of a package. No return address. Left at our front step. Ivy opened it carefully, using gloves. Inside was a burned copy of the Herald Tribune article, blackened at the edges. And a single sheet of paper with bold, printed letters, You're ruining your family. This doesn't end well for traitors. No name. No handwriting. But I knew who sent it. I gave it to the police. They opened a protective order. A patrol car now passed the house 3 times a night. Ivy installed new locks, floodlights, motion cameras. Grace slept in my room. I kept a fire poker beside the bed. I wasn't afraid to use it. But beneath the fear, there was something else growing, support. Letters arrived. Emails. Calls. Strangers reached out with stories of their own, abuse, fraud, financial silence within families. Women who were never believed. Sons who turned into strangers. Husbands who weaponized trust. The shame I had carried for years slowly began to dissolve in the light of those stories. And that's when I knew, Caleb's biggest weapon had never been the fraud. Or the threats. Or the manipulation. It was the silence. He counted on it. Built his life on it. And now? Silence was the very thing I was burning to the ground. The morning began quiet, too quiet, like the kind of stillness that always comes before something breaks. The sky hung heavy with low clouds, gray and thick, as if even the weather was holding its breath. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the birdbath Caleb gave me one Mother's Day, back when he still pretended to care. The water was still. The birds hadn't come. Ivy was in the den, combing through the latest calls from new victims. Her spreadsheet now stretched to over 90 names. 90 families. 90 stolen futures. The task force was preparing indictments. The prosecutor had already reached out for a formal statement from me. It was moving fast now. Irreversible. But something didn't sit right in my bones. It wasn't fear. I'd grown past that. It was something colder, heavier. Like a shadow had stepped into the room before its owner. Around 2:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. Grace was upstairs napping. Ivy looked up from her laptop. Expecting anyone? I shook my head and moved toward the front door. Through the peephole, I saw him. Caleb. His hair was unkempt. His face thinner. A rough beard had overtaken his once polished jawline. He looked like a man unraveling. But his eyes were the same. Calculating. Cold. I didn't open the door. He knocked again, harder this time. Mom. I stayed silent. Mom, please, he said. I just want to talk. Ivy stepped up beside me. Don't, she whispered. He's not here to apologize. I know, I replied. He knocked again, now with urgency. You've made your point. Okay? You won. It's all falling apart. My accounts are frozen. Cheryl left. I lost the firm. You got what you wanted. Are you happy now? His voice cracked, but I knew that sound. It wasn't remorse. It was desperation. Caleb wasn't sorry. He was cornered. I opened the door. Just the screen door stood between us. I made no move to unlock it. He stared at me like I was a stranger. You destroyed me, he said. No, I replied, steady. You did that yourself. I just turned on the light. He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. Do you even care what this is doing to Grace? To your granddaughter? I care about her more than you ever did. He leaned closer, his voice low and bitter. This won't end the way you think. Won't it? I said, tilting my head. Because as far as I can see, it's already ended. I'm not scared of you anymore. And if you've come here to threaten me, you might want to look around. This house is wired. Every word you say is being recorded. Every second of this is documented. He stiffened. Then he laughed. Short. Hollow. You used to be weak. You begged me to stay. You clung to me like a child clings to its only candle in the dark. But now you're what? Some righteous crusader? No, I said. I'm a mother who stopped believing that love meant silence. We stood like that for a moment, him outside, trembling from anger and unraveling pride, and me inside, calm, unshaken, finally taller than the shadow that raised him. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. You think you're safe, he whispered, but there are people I've done favors for. People who owe me. You take away their money, their secrets, don't be surprised when they take something from you. Ivy was already dialing the police. I think you should leave, I said, stepping back. He stared at me for another second, then turned and walked down the steps. I watched until he was gone. That night, the police added a direct security line to our home. Ivy called a former colleague who specialized in high-profile fraud cases. We gave them Caleb's threat, word for word, with the recording to back it up. But I couldn't sleep. Not because I feared what he might do next. But because I knew the truth, Caleb wasn't working alone. We'd always assumed he was the architect of his empire. But now, I saw it differently. His schemes, his reach, the depth of the cover-ups, they were too polished for one man. There were others. Maybe even worse. And now they knew my name. Just before dawn, I opened my notebook and wrote 6 words on the last blank page. I'm ready for all of them. After Caleb's threat at my doorstep, every creak of the house felt sharper. Ivy and I slept in shifts. We kept the porch light on, the blinds drawn, and the emergency number taped to the fridge like a warning label. Grace moved into the guest room beside mine, and every night before bed, I checked the locks, twice. Not out of fear, but vigilance. Fear was something I used to feel when I had no voice. Now, I had one, and I would use it, even if it trembled. The task force had begun issuing subpoenas. Several banks had turned over evidence without resistance. Caleb's name was officially under investigation on both state and federal levels. Still, the silence from some corners of the fraud trail concerned Ivy. One account in particular, labeled Eastbridge Holding Cooperative, was proving unusually difficult to crack. They're stalling, Ivy said, scrolling through encrypted files. There's something deeper buried in this shell company. The address is fake, but the routing numbers connect to an investment account that Caleb accessed weekly. Can we trace it? I asked. We're trying. But someone scrubbed the metadata. She didn't have to say it. Whoever helped Caleb set this up wasn't just some local scammer. This was someone experienced, maybe even professional. And they were protecting more than just Caleb's reputation. They were protecting their own. That afternoon, as Ivy worked through her files and Grace quietly painted by the window, I decided to go into the basement. I don't know why. Maybe it was the feeling in my bones, that whisper of unfinished business. Or maybe it was instinct. The kind you develop after raising a liar. The air downstairs was musty and stale. I pulled the string on the overhead bulb and walked along the back wall, running my hand along the cracked cement. I had hidden important things down here over the years, documents, emergency cash, letters from my husband. And then I remembered something I hadn't thought about in almost 15 years. The floorboard in the laundry corner. I pushed aside the rusted hamper, crouched low, and lifted the loose board with a screwdriver. It came free with a sigh of dust and old secrets. Beneath it sat a small black metal box. It wasn't locked. Just heavy. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was an old red ledger. My breath caught in my throat. I opened it. The pages were filled with notes. Account numbers. Names. Symbols. My husband's handwriting, careful and mechanical. But some pages had a second hand scribbled beside his. One I recognized instantly. Caleb's. And then I saw it, a column of numbers tied to a bank account I didn't recognize. The name, Eastbridge, appeared over and over, dated all the way back to when Caleb was 19. I stared at the page, a chill crawling up my spine. This account didn't start during Caleb's adult years. It began while my husband was still alive. Ivy's footsteps echoed above me. I called her name. When she came down, I handed her the ledger. Her brows furrowed deeper with every page she turned. This. Eleanor, this goes back decades. These aren't just fraud entries. These are transfers between shell entities, some linked to nonprofits and civic groups. This isn't just Caleb. Someone helped him build this before he ever had the skill to. I swallowed hard. You think my husband was involved? I don't know. But look at this. She flipped to a section labeled Guardian Circle Fund. Several transactions listed under initial seed gifts were made in both my husband's and Caleb's names. Another section was labeled Midnight Checks, no paper trail. I pressed my fingers to my temple. Could he have built something that Caleb later twisted? Or, Ivy said slowly, he built it with Caleb from the beginning. I staggered back from the bench. He was an accountant. A church deacon. He wasn't a thief. But people like Caleb don't become monsters overnight, Ivy said gently. They learn it. From someone. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My husband had died a quiet man, respected and mourned. I had never questioned his integrity. Never suspected him of anything more than working long hours and keeping to himself. But now? Now I wasn't sure who I'd been married to. That night, I sat on the porch wrapped in my shawl, the ledger in my lap. The stars above blinked like they knew too much. Grace brought me a cup of tea. You okay? She asked. I don't know, I said. Some truths make you feel free. Others make you feel like the floor under your life was never solid. She sat beside me. But it's better to know, right? I looked at her, this girl with her mother's eyes but none of her cruelty. Yes, I said. It's better. Even if it hurts. Inside, Ivy had already begun scanning the ledger. She called a contact at the Attorney General's office. If your husband helped set this up, she told me later, Caleb may not be the only one going down. But you may be the only one left with the full picture. I stared out the window. And I wondered, how deep did this betrayal go? I couldn't stop staring at that red ledger. The ink faded in places, the pages fragile with time, but the weight of it was unbearable. A book of truths I never asked for, never would have believed if I hadn't held it in my own hands. It sat in the center of the dining table while Ivy scanned its pages one by one, each scan another nail in the coffin of the life I thought I'd lived. I sat across from her, numb. For 47 years, I'd spoken about my husband, Arthur Briggs, like he was a man of honor. The quiet, numbers-minded provider. Reserved. Distant, yes, but I chalked that up to the grief he carried from childhood, from his father's brutal temper and his mother's suicide. I believed him when he said he stayed late at the office to help balance the books for the church or the town's volunteer center. I believed him when he said he wanted Caleb to learn business early, that their projects were just math games between father and son. But this ledger said otherwise. There were handwritten notes in the margins beside the earliest entries. C. Secured. M. V. Reliable. E. Doesn't ask questions. That last one, my name, reduced to a passing observation, burned. E. Doesn't ask questions. I had asked, of course. Once or twice. But Arthur always dismissed me with a gentle smile and that low, calm voice. Just boring money stuff, Ellie. You wouldn't want to waste your time. And I'd smiled, nodded, and walked away. Grateful he took care of it all. Now I knew, I had been groomed into silence. Slowly. Deliberately. Do you want to stop for the night? Ivy asked gently, eyes red from reading for hours. No, I whispered. Keep going. By midnight, she had identified 5 more shell accounts tied directly to Arthur, each one passed on to Caleb after his death. Ivy didn't say it, but I could see it on her face. This wasn't just a son gone bad. This was a father and son scheme, a generational deception buried under handshakes and funeral hymns. The Briggs name wasn't just stained. It had never been clean. I slept for maybe 2 hours. If you could call it sleep. At 5:11 a.m., I sat in the kitchen, watching the sun rise like a guilty witness. I poured a cup of coffee and stared at the steam, trying to figure out how I would tell Grace the truth, that her grandfather, too, might have been a criminal. Not the kindly man whose portrait still hung in the hallway. But a man who knew exactly what he was teaching his son. And then I made a decision. I want to go public with the ledger, I told Ivy when she woke. I want them to see the truth, all of it. Even if it makes people hate me. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She simply nodded and said, then we need a full press statement. You ready to go on camera? I wasn't sure. But I said yes anyway. By afternoon, we were at the local station. The same anchor who had interviewed me after the Tribune piece now welcomed me with a handshake and eyes full of worry. You don't have to talk about your husband if you're not ready, she said. No, I said. That's the part that matters most now. The cameras rolled. I looked into the lens, into the eyes of thousands of strangers I'd never meet, and I told them what I had found. About the floorboard. The ledger. The handwriting I knew better than my own. I spoke of the shock, the betrayal, and the heavy shame that came with realizing I had slept beside a man I never fully knew. I talked about the legacy I thought I was protecting, and how wrong I had been. I didn't speak up for years because I thought silence meant loyalty, I said into the mic, but silence was permission. I gave permission to a monster without realizing it. And my son learned everything from watching me not ask questions. That's what shame does. It teaches you how to look away. I paused, breath trembling. But I'm not looking away anymore. When the segment ended, the station went quiet. The crew, young, overworked, stood motionless. And then one of the interns, barely more than a teenager, walked up to me and whispered, "My grandmother never spoke up. But if she had, maybe I wouldn't have had to." That night, the video aired. Within an hour, it was shared across multiple platforms. Ivy's inbox flooded. The prosecutor's office called twice. New victims. New witnesses. New questions. But no one heard from Caleb. Not a word. Not a whisper. He had vanished. And now I wasn't just a mother or a widow. I was the keeper of every truth they tried to bury. The silence that followed my interview wasn't comforting. It was the kind that lingered too long, like stale air before a coming storm. For 2 full days, there was no word from Caleb. Not a call. Not a post. Not a public denial. Just a void. And in that void, dread grew. The world now knew who Arthur Briggs really was, or had likely been. My interview had gone viral, reaching places I'd never imagined, financial justice blogs, elder advocacy networks, even a national podcast requested a follow-up. My face was everywhere, an aging widow turned whistleblower. Some praised me. Others accused me of defaming my own blood. But none of that mattered. Because my son had vanished. It was Ivy who first noticed the signs. His email accounts were deleted, she said, scanning her laptop in the dining room. His company's domain is down. Social media? Scrubbed. Even his online banking portal, access revoked or hidden behind proxies. I swallowed. He's running. Or he's hiding. Is there a difference? I asked quietly. She looked at me, solemn. Yes. One means fear. The other means planning. By evening, the front doorbell rang again. But this time, it wasn't Caleb. It was a man in a charcoal trench coat, his badge already displayed. Agent Ronald Keyes, from the Financial Crimes Division. We believe your son may be fleeing the country, he said the moment he stepped inside. There's reason to believe he's connected to a much larger laundering operation tied to multiple fraudulent retirement trusts across 3 states. You may have just unearthed the tip of something much larger. He opened a folder and laid down a photo, an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, its beneficiary name, a Briggs Memorial Trust. A twisted irony. My husband's name used as a shield for the very crimes I was now uncovering. You think my husband helped him set this up? I asked. We can't be sure. But based on the dates in the ledger and these transfers, it's highly likely. Caleb didn't build this system. He inherited it. And then expanded it. My hands gripped the arms of my chair. Keyes continued. We have one question for you, Mrs. Briggs. Are you willing to testify before a federal grand jury? I nodded slowly. I didn't come this far to hide. He gave me a grim smile. Then I suggest you prepare for a trial. And for the media storm that will come with it. The minute he left, I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of that truth press into my chest. This wasn't just about my son anymore. This was about exposure, legacy, and survival. That night, Grace knocked on my door just as I was getting ready for bed. She climbed in beside me without saying a word. We lay there for several minutes, just breathing in the dark, until she finally asked, "Is he ever coming back?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said the thing I hadn't admitted to anyone, not even Ivy. I don't know if I want him to. Grace didn't flinch. I think I understand, she said softly. The next day brought another letter, this one slid under our front door. No stamp. No return address. Ivy opened it, gloved. We read it together. It was a single sheet of unlined paper, typed. If you keep talking, others will fall. You don't know what you're messing with. Some truths are meant to stay buried. It wasn't signed. But taped to the bottom was something that made my stomach twist. A torn piece of my late husband's college diploma. Not Caleb's. Arthur's. I sat down hard on the kitchen stool. They're trying to rattle you, Ivy said, fire in her voice. They already did, I whispered. But not the way they think. Because now I knew, I hadn't uncovered the truth yet. Not the whole truth. Someone was still trying to keep Arthur's legacy intact. Not for love. For protection. And whoever they were watching me. Maybe even from inside the family. I looked out the window, the sky gray with summer rain. Then I walked down the hall, past the portraits on the wall, wedding photos, baby pictures, holidays, and I stopped at Arthur's. I stared into the eyes of the man I married. I don't know who you were, I said under my breath. But I know who I am now. The whistleblower. The witness. The woman who lived long enough to become dangerous. The next morning, I removed Arthur's portrait from the wall. I needed to see what was behind it. Not metaphorically, physically. Ivy had taught me that people like Caleb, and clearly Arthur too, hid things in plain sight. False panels. Modified safes. A secret doesn't need a lock when it's buried in nostalgia. And sure enough, when I ran my fingers along the back of the frame, I felt it. A shallow cut in the drywall. Ivy helped me remove it carefully, 2 screws and a light tap with a flat tool. Behind it was a thin black binder, the kind you'd never give a second glance in an office. Inside were letters. Pages and pages of typed and handwritten notes. The first few were addressed to M.V. Martin Vexler. The same man Caleb had hired years later. But these letters? They were dated back to 1995. Long before Caleb was ever capable of building a fraud empire. Arthur had been the architect. The mentor. The gatekeeper of a multi-decade laundering scheme disguised as community support. I read line after line in growing horror. One letter said, "C is learning fast. Smarter than I expected. He asks the right questions, and he's bold. Might be too bold. We'll need to rein him in later." Another, "E is better left unaware. The less she knows, the safer we all are. She's loyal, but her conscience is dangerous." That one hurt. Not because it was untrue, but because he knew it. He married me for it, and then used it against me. "Do you think he ever loved you?" Ivy asked gently, placing the binder on the kitchen table. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to. But that night, I dreamed of Arthur for the first time in years. Not the Arthur from our wedding, or the Arthur who taught Caleb to ride a bike. This Arthur had shadows under his eyes, wore a suit 2 sizes too large, and whispered, "You looked away. That's why I chose you." I woke drenched in sweat, hands curled into fists. By morning, my resolve had changed. This wasn't just about justice. This was about dismantling the entire myth that had silenced me. It was Ivy who discovered the final link. She called me into the den, where she had a spreadsheet open with bank codes and timestamps. "There's something strange here," she said. One of the accounts connected to the A. Briggs Memorial Trust made consistent deposits to a local real estate firm. Small amounts. Quiet. Traced through shell accounts. "So?" I asked. "So," she continued, "that firm is co-owned by someone we know. Look." She turned the laptop toward me. I read the name twice before it sank in. Cheryl's brother. Marcus. The same one who officiated their wedding. The same one who had moved abroad shortly after Arthur's death. "That's why she married Caleb," I whispered. "Not for love. For legacy. For protection." "And they kept it going," Ivy said. "Marcus handled the laundering through property sales. Caleb created fake trusts. Arthur trained them both. It was a family business. And I was the last one to know." I sat back slowly, breath leaving my body like a deflating balloon. I thought I had reached the bottom of this story, but now I saw I'd only peeled back the topsoil. The real rot ran deeper. Decades deeper. "We need to go back," I said suddenly. "To where?" "To the cemetery." Ivy didn't question me. She drove us to the small, windswept hill where Arthur was buried. The clouds above were thick with the threat of rain, and the trees swayed like they were trying to warn us away. I stood at Arthur's grave for a long time, staring down at the polished stone. Beloved husband. Devoted father. A lie etched in granite. "I used to talk to you here," I said quietly. "After you died, I came every week. I'd tell you how Caleb was doing. How lonely the house felt. I lit candles for you. Prayed over your memory." I paused, the wind tugging at my sleeves. "And the whole time, you were the one who started all of this." I took the bundle of letters Ivy had photocopied and laid them at the base of the headstone. "Here's your legacy," I whispered. "Let the dirt keep your secrets now. I'm done carrying them." Ivy reached out and placed her hand on my shoulder. "We take the whole system down now. Every name. Every fund. Every shadow." "Yes," I said. "We burn it from the roots." We left the cemetery in silence. But inside me, something had changed. My grief had no more room to grow. It had been replaced by something colder. Resolve. If Arthur built the machine, and Caleb expanded it, then I would be the one to dismantle it. Not just as their wife. Not just as their mother. But as the woman who survived them both, and lived to tell the world exactly how. I dressed for court the way I once dressed for my husband's funeral: simple blouse, dark skirt, my wedding ring still resting on the chain around my neck. That ring hadn't touched my finger in weeks. Not since I learned what Arthur had hidden behind the bedtime kisses, the paperwork, and the late office hours. It felt strange, carrying the symbol of a man I now knew was a stranger. But I kept it close, not as a keepsake, but as evidence. Not all scars are visible. Some are shaped like gold bands. Ivy sat beside me in the courthouse hallway. She had brought 2 folders, one for my official statement, and another for everything else we didn't dare hand over yet. "We released this after your testimony," she said. "Not before. We want the timing to land like thunder." Outside the courtroom, news vans gathered. I hadn't realized how far this story had spread. The widow of Arthur Briggs. The mother of Caleb Briggs. Now the woman prepared to testify under oath against both. They were calling me brave. But bravery isn't something you feel. It's something you do while your hands are shaking. Inside, the grand jury room wasn't as dramatic as I'd imagined. No gavel. No shouting. Just a long table, 3 prosecutors, and a court reporter. My heart pounded as I took the oath. My voice sounded too calm. Too rehearsed. But I told the truth, every word of it. I started with Caleb's humiliating public attack in the living room. Then I described the envelope in the attic. The files. The forged documents. The victims. The letter under the door. And finally, the ledger hidden behind Arthur's portrait. The room was silent as I described the financial threads Arthur had spun like cobwebs, how Caleb inherited the scheme like an heirloom. And how Cheryl's brother Marcus had tied it all together like the final knot in a noose. "Did you ever suspect your husband?" one of the prosecutors asked. "No," I replied. "And that's what makes it worse. Why come forward now?" I looked at them, the weight of decades pressing behind my eyes. Because silence protects no one. Because I didn't know who I married, but I know exactly who I've become. And because somewhere out there, another woman is being told she's crazy, or overreacting, or imagining the cracks in her family, and I want her to know she's not. When I stepped out of the courtroom, Ivy was waiting, her arms crossed and eyes scanning the hallway. "You did it," she said. I nodded, but I didn't feel triumph. I felt hollow. Like I had just buried something I hadn't even finished mourning. That afternoon, we returned home to find the front gate left ajar. Ivy's shoulders tensed instantly. "Wait here," she said. But I didn't. I walked straight to the porch, where a white envelope sat wedged under the doormat. Inside was a newspaper clipping, from the day of Arthur's death. Heart failure. Sudden. Peaceful. On the back, written in red ink, were the words, "You think you know how this ends?" I handed it to Ivy without a word. "They're getting desperate," she muttered. "We're too close. Someone out there is losing sleep." That evening, we received a secure call from Agent Keys. "They found Marcus," he said. "Costa Rica. Under a different name. Fake passport. We've issued an extradition request. He's connected to an international laundering ring. You were right, this goes far beyond your family." I leaned against the wall. "What about Caleb?" "He's still off-grid. But Marcus will talk. Men like him always do when the floor drops out." After the call, I sat alone in the kitchen with a glass of water I couldn't finish. Grace was at her friend's house, finally laughing again, painting nails and watching movies. Ivy was asleep upstairs for once. And I, after everything, felt the quiet as something sacred. Then, without thinking, I reached for the wedding ring around my neck. I held it for a moment. Remembered Arthur's hands. His voice. The life we built. Then I stood up, walked to the sink, and dropped the ring into the drain. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just turned on the garbage disposal and listened. Not out of spite. But closure. Because sometimes, love isn't what binds us. Sometimes, truth is. And I had finally chosen it. The days after my testimony felt like walking a tightrope stretched over a yawning chasm. Each step forward was balanced precariously between relief and dread. Relief, because the truth, the long-hidden, bitter truth, had finally spilled out into the open. And dread, because I knew the fight was only beginning. The private agony I carried had transformed into a public battle, messy and merciless. The media frenzy that had surrounded my home after the interview slowly quieted, but the threats did not. The cacophony of cameras and flashing lights gave way to shadows, messages slipped under doors in plain white envelopes, phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and the unsettling feeling that someone was watching every move I made. One afternoon, Ivy and I were entrenched in sorting through mountains of new documents and victim testimonies. Our office, once quiet and orderly, was now a buzzing hive of activity. My granddaughter Grace was at school, thankfully shielded from the worst of it for the moment. I answered a call that flashed on the screen from an unknown number, my heart skipping. The voice that greeted me was quiet, cautious, yet resolute. "Mrs. Briggs?" "My name is Clara," the woman said softly. "I'm a former employee at Marcus's real estate firm. I have information that might help your case." I exchanged a glance with Ivy, who had quietly joined me at the desk. There was something in Clara's tone that sparked a cautious hope. I urged her to speak freely. Over the next hour, Clara laid bare a shadowy web that stretched far beyond what Ivy and I had uncovered so far. She described falsified contracts, properties sold beneath market value to offshore companies, and a tangle of financial accounts designed to keep the Briggs family's illicit operations hidden from even the sharpest eyes. She spoke of meetings where Marcus, Caleb's brother-in-law, boasted about maintaining the family's secrets like a sacred trust. Her voice trembled when she confessed her fear of retaliation but steeled itself in the hope that justice could finally be served. Ivy began taking meticulous notes, capturing every detail Clara shared, the names of associates, dates of transactions, and even recordings Clara had secretly saved. This was a breakthrough, a direct line into the network that had shielded Caleb and Marcus for so long. That evening, after Clara's call, the air around our house felt electric. Grace found me in the living room, eyes bright despite the weight pressing down on us all. "Grandma," she said, wrapping her arms around me tightly, "I'm scared. But I'm proud of you." I held her close, brushing back the strands of her hair. "We're going to get through this," I whispered. "Together." But the shadows lurking in the light of our fight were far from done. A few nights later, as Ivy and I were locking up the office, I found a folded note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. The paper was coarse and unforgiving to the touch. In bold, threatening letters, it read, "Stop digging or the next silence will be permanent." I ran my fingers over the words, my skin prickling with a mix of fear and defiance. Ivy found me moments later, holding the note, and her eyes flared with determination. "They think they can intimidate us," she said, voice low. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." And she was right. Because every threat only fueled the fire that had been burning inside me for years. The fire that refused to be extinguished by fear, lies, or silence. Days later, the task force contacted us with news that their investigation was picking up steam. Federal agents were tracing transactions linked to Marcus's firm and other shell companies connected to the Briggs network. Witnesses began to come forward, emboldened by the growing attention and the breaking of decades-long silence. Yet, amid the rising tide of justice, I couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper we delved, the more dangerous our path became. The forces that had held this network together were vast and well-connected, and they would not go quietly into the night. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table sifting through new evidence, Grace entered quietly, her small hand reaching for mine. "Grandma," she said softly, "do you think they'll try to hurt us?" I looked down at her, the fierce love I felt almost overwhelming. "They might try," I said honestly, "but we have each other, and we have the truth. And that's stronger than any threat." Her eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded bravely. That night, I lay awake listening to the creaks and sighs of the house, the world outside filled with quiet storms, both literal and metaphorical. I thought about the women who had come forward, about the lives damaged and stolen by greed and cruelty, and about the strength it took to speak their truth. In the darkest moments, I remembered the faces of those I loved, the legacy I wanted to leave, not one of secrets and lies, but of courage and justice. And as dawn broke, spilling soft light across the floorboards, I knew I would continue this fight, no matter the cost. Because the light, once turned on, could never be hidden again. The investigation was no longer just a thread unraveling, it had become a sprawling web that reached into corners I had never imagined. Every day brought new revelations, each one heavier than the last. Ivy and I were no longer simply mother and niece fighting a family scandal. We were the front line in a war against a network of deception that had thrived in shadows for decades. That morning, as the sun rose weakly through the gray clouds, Ivy's phone buzzed incessantly. She glanced at the screen and sighed, her eyes dark with exhaustion. "It's from the prosecutor's office," she said. "They've uncovered financial ties linking Marcus's firm to several offshore accounts in Panama." I set my coffee down, the bitter taste grounding me in the present. "And Caleb?" "They found bank records showing he funneled large sums through those accounts, payments disguised as consulting fees. The money trail goes cold after a certain point. Someone's cleaning it up." The realization was chilling. We were dealing not just with family greed but with professionals who knew how to erase footprints. Days blurred into nights filled with phone calls, document reviews, and strategy sessions. Ivy had become my anchor, her sharp mind cutting through lies, her steady presence a balm to my fraying nerves. One afternoon, a knock at the door startled me. Standing outside was a man I hadn't seen in years, Henry Monroe, an old friend of my late husband and one of the few people who had always been kind to me. "I heard about everything," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I want to help." I studied his face, lined but sincere. "Why now?" He swallowed. "Because I never believed Arthur was just an honest man. There were rumors back then. I've kept my distance, but after the article, I realized I couldn't stay silent." He handed me a thick envelope, filled with handwritten ledgers and correspondence he had secretly kept, evidence suggesting Arthur's involvement went even deeper than I'd imagined. I felt the weight of the past crash down. It wasn't just Caleb or Marcus. Arthur's shadow stretched wider, darker. That evening, as Ivy and I pored over the new evidence, Grace sat quietly in the corner, watching us with wide eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, "are you scared?" I reached out, pulling her close. "Yes, sweetheart. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you have when fear tries to take over." The next day brought a chilling reminder that the people we were exposing were watching. A car sped past the house, its windows darkened and tinted. Ivy caught the license plate and called the police. "We're poking a nest of vipers," Ivy said grimly. And the vipers were striking back. A letter arrived, typed and unsigned. "Stop this now, or the consequences won't be just threats." Yet, I refused to be cowed. I was no longer the frightened widow who had once turned away. I was a woman armed with truth, and a network of support. I called a meeting with the victims' families. Their faces told stories of pain and resilience. Together, we formed a pact, to stand united, to face whatever came next, and to make sure the shadows that hid our tormentors were exposed to the light. The stakes had never been higher. The risks, greater. But so was our resolve. Because some webs, once touched, cannot be untangled. They only tighten. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. After weeks of preparations, hearings, and testimonies, today marked the beginning of the trial that would decide not only Caleb's fate but the legacy of deceit spanning 2 generations. As I sat beside Ivy in the wooden benches, the weight of every secret, every betrayal pressed down on me like a stone. I glanced at Grace, who sat quietly in the gallery, clutching a small notebook. Her presence was my anchor, reminder of what this fight was truly for. Though she was only 16, she carried a maturity beyond her years, tempered by the chaos that had engulfed our family. The prosecutor rose first, laying out the extensive evidence collected, forged documents, fraudulent trusts, offshore accounts, and testimony from dozens of victims. It was a damning mosaic, painstakingly pieced together. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand, heart pounding but resolve still strong. I told my story not just as a mother betrayed, but as a woman who had uncovered a sprawling network of lies. I spoke of the ledger hidden behind my husband's portrait, the quiet manipulation by those I once trusted, and the decades of silence that had allowed it all to flourish. As I recounted the moments of fear, humiliation, and finally courage, I felt the courtroom shift. Faces softened, eyes glistened, and the weight of truth settled like a heavy fog over us all. But the trial was only the beginning. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as Caleb's once confident smirk faded to a mask of desperation. His allies began to abandon him, contracts were torn up, and his empire crumbled publicly. Still, threats continued. The police increased security around our home. Anonymous calls and letters reminded us that exposing powerful men came with a price. Yet, through it all, we stood firm. One evening, as I returned home after a long day, I found a bouquet of wildflowers on the doorstep. No note. Just blooms, simple, unassuming, yet unmistakably a gesture of solidarity. I smiled, knowing that for every shadow, there was light. For every silence broken, a new voice ready to speak. The fight was far from over, but I was no longer alone. Together, we would see it through. The courthouse was imposing, its cold stone walls rising like silent sentinels over the streets where life went on outside, oblivious to the storm brewing within. Each morning I crossed its threshold, I felt both a strange comfort and an unbearable weight. This building held the truth, raw, merciless, and impossible to escape. For months now, the trial had been dragging on, revealing layers of deceit that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. But with every day, every testimony, I felt those walls inch closer, closing in not just on Caleb, but on me, Ivy, Grace, and the fragile remnants of what remained of our family. Ivy was a constant beside me, her eyes sharp, voice steady, mind razor-focused. She had become more than my niece, she was my shield, my partner in this battle against a legacy of lies. Grace, too, was growing into a remarkable young woman. Sitting quietly in the gallery, clutching a small notebook where she diligently scribbled notes and observations, she embodied the very reason I fought, to protect the next generation from the poison of silence and betrayal. The morning's proceedings began with the prosecution calling Clara, Marcus's former employee. She was someone I'd never met before but had come forward months ago, risking everything to shine light on the darkness Marcus had helped weave. She entered the courtroom with quiet dignity, her voice unwavering as she described the intricate machinery behind the laundering operation, falsified contracts, intentional destruction of incriminating documents, and the cold, calculated ruthlessness with which the family treated their victims. Her words were vivid and painful, painting a picture so stark that even hardened faces in the courtroom softened. I caught glimpses of the jury, some nodding, others visibly shaken, and a few biting their lips to hold back tears. The weight of her testimony hung heavy, a damning blow to the defense's carefully constructed facade. When Clara finished, the defense attorney wasted no time. He approached the witness stand with a cold smile, eyes narrowing as he prepared to unravel the fabric of truth that had begun to form. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, turning his gaze to me, "you've accused your late husband of being complicit in these crimes. Yet, you never reported any suspicions during his lifetime. Why is that?" His words were designed to cut, to make me doubt myself, but I refused to yield. "I loved him," I said firmly, my voice carrying the weight of years. "And I wanted to believe he was a good man. But love does not blind forever. It only takes time for the truth to surface." He pressed, relentless. "And what of your son? You testified that you overlooked signs of his wrongdoing for years. How can we trust that you're telling the whole truth now?" The courtroom fell silent. I drew a deep breath, steadying myself against the tide of accusation. I was silenced, I answered honestly. By shame, fear, and the hope that things would change. But no more. This is the truth, painful and difficult, but necessary. His attempts to discredit me only strengthened my resolve. Each question, each insinuation, chipped away at the lies Caleb and his defenders had built. I spoke not just as a mother betrayed, but as a woman who had unearthed a family's rotten core and refused to stay silent any longer. Outside the courthouse, the world was watching. Caleb's supporters were falling away, their faith shattered by mounting evidence. His social media presence became a barrage of condemnation and disbelief, and one by one, business partners severed ties, eager to distance themselves before the inevitable collapse. His empire was crumbling, publicly and painfully. But as his world fell apart, the threats escalated. One evening, Ivy and I were working late when I found a folded envelope slipped beneath our front door. Inside was a photograph of Grace, taken while she walked home from school. On the back, a chilling message written in sharp black ink: "Stop this or she pays." My heart seized in terror and anger. For a moment, the fear I had fought to bury threatened to consume me. But then I remembered the faces of the victims, the whispered confessions, and the fire that had burned inside me all these years. I balled the note in my hand and met Ivy's eyes. "They want to break us." "We won't let them," she replied fiercely. "I'll make sure Grace has protection. We'll stand firm." The days that followed were a whirlwind of heightened security, police patrols, surveillance cameras, and safety plans. Grace refused to live in fear. She insisted on continuing her life, attending school, spending time with friends, and laughing. Her courage became a beacon in the darkness, reminding me why this fight mattered. Amid the danger, something beautiful was blossoming. Victims and their families, once isolated and silent, began reaching out. Letters arrived filled with stories of pain and endurance. Emails flooded in, offering support and sharing their own broken silences. Phone calls connected us, weaving a network of strength and shared purpose. One afternoon, as I tended to the garden, a woman approached me quietly. "Mrs. Briggs," she said, voice trembling, "I'm Sarah. My mother was one of Caleb's victims. I want to thank you. You've given us courage to speak out." Tears pricked my eyes as I took her hand. "Thank you, Sarah. You and your mother are why I keep fighting." That evening, Ivy and I sat by the fireplace, exhaustion settling into our bones. The fight was far from over, but hope had begun to flicker through the darkness. "We're close," Ivy said softly. "The grand jury will review all the evidence next week. If they indict, Caleb's reign finally ends." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. And then the healing begins. But as I looked out the window at the stars twinkling faintly in the dark sky, I understood this journey was far from simple. Truth, justice, and peace were paths lined with shadows and light, twists and turns. I was ready to walk it, no matter the cost. Because silence was a prison. And I was free. The day of the grand jury hearing dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. I woke early, the weight of months pressing on my chest like a stone. Ivy was already up, sifting through documents, her eyes tired but fierce. Grace came downstairs dressed in her usual quiet bravery, hugging me tightly before we left. As we drove toward the courthouse, the world outside seemed oblivious to the battles waging inside our hearts. But inside me, every step was charged, the culmination of years of silence, shame, and pain was finally about to be spoken aloud. We entered the courthouse with a mix of nervousness and determination. The grand jury room was smaller than I expected, a circle of faces, some familiar, some strangers. I sat in the witness chair, Ivy beside me, Grace just outside. The prosecutor began, her voice steady. "Mrs. Briggs, we are here to determine if there is sufficient evidence to indict Caleb Briggs and others connected with the financial crimes you've uncovered. Please tell us everything." I breathed deeply and recounted the full story, the humiliation Caleb inflicted, the forged documents hidden away, the ledger beneath Arthur's portrait, the web of deceit spanning 2 generations. I named names, described schemes, and spoke of victims who had found courage through this process. Each word felt like breaking a chain. The jurors listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. Their expressions ranged from shock to sorrow, but never doubt. The truth was clear. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then one juror spoke softly, "Mrs. Briggs, your courage has shed light on something dark and widespread. This evidence is more than enough." A wave of relief and exhaustion swept through me. Outside, the rain began to fall, washing the city clean. The media waited eagerly. Ivy guided me through questions about the fight, the fears, and the hope. I spoke not just for myself, but for every silent voice. No one should suffer in silence, I told them. Truth is our strongest weapon. As the day closed, we returned home to find Grace waiting on the porch, her face bright despite the weather. Later that night, Ivy, Grace, and I sat together in the living room. The fight had been brutal, but the walls were finally crumbling. I looked at them, feeling an overwhelming peace. "Thank you," I whispered, "for standing by me." Grace smiled. "We're stronger because we're together." The phone rang. It was the DA's office. An indictment had been filed. Justice was finally within reach. I placed my hand over my heart, knowing this was not the end, but a beginning. For truth. For healing. For all of us. Before you scroll away, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And tell me, where are you watching from? Your stories matter. Because no one should ever feel alone in the fight for justice.